Close your eyes for a moment and think about sleep. What does normal sleep look like to you? If you're like most people living in the modern world, you probably picture something quite specific. You imagine climbing into bed sometime between 9 and 11 at night. You settle in, perhaps read for a few minutes, or scroll through your phone. Then darkness. Sleep takes you, and ideally, you don't wake up again until morning, 7, maybe 8 hours later. One continuous, unbroken block of rest. That's it. That's sleep. This is what we've come to think of as normal. Natural, even. The way humans are supposed to sleep. When you wake up in the middle of the night, at 2 in the morning or 3 or 4, and find yourself staring at the ceiling, unable to fall back asleep right away, you might feel frustrated, anxious. You might wonder what's wrong. Is it stress? Too much caffeine? A sleep disorder? Should you see a doctor? Take melatonin? Buy blackout curtains or a white noise machine? Our entire modern world seems to agree on this 8-hour blueprint. Your alarm clock demands it. Your work schedule requires it. Schools structure their days around it. Sleep scientists study it. Doctors recommend it. Self-help books promise to help you achieve it. The fitness tracker on your wrist monitors it, giving you a sleep score each morning, rating how well you conformed to this ideal. Sleeping through the night, uninterrupted, has become not just a goal, but a measure of health, of normalcy, of whether you're doing life correctly. But here's something remarkable, something that might change the way you think about those middle-of-the-night awakenings forever. This way of sleeping, this solid 8-hour block we treat as ancient and natural, is actually very, very new. Historically speaking, it's barely a blip, a recent invention. For the vast majority of human existence, people didn't sleep this way at all. Let that sink in for a moment. The sleep pattern we consider normal, the one we structure our entire lives around, the one that causes us anxiety when we can't achieve it, has only been normal for a tiny fraction of human history. Perhaps just the last century or two, maybe even less. So how did our ancestors sleep? The answer is both surprising and, in a way, rather comforting. For most of human history, we're talking thousands upon thousands of years, sleep was fluid, flexible, broken into pieces. It was deeply, intimately tied to the rhythms of natural light and darkness, not to the rigid ticking of clocks or the demands of factory whistles and office schedules. Before the Industrial Revolution transformed nearly every aspect of human life, people often slept in multiple bouts scattered across the 24-hour cycle. Not one long stretch, but several shorter ones. Sleep was more like a conversation with the night, a back and forth, not a single, unbroken monologue. This pattern had names. Sometimes it was called biphasic sleep, 2 distinct periods of sleep in a day. Sometimes polyphasic, multiple periods. The specifics varied by culture, by season, by individual need. But the common thread was this: sleep was not consolidated into one chunk. And here's what's particularly fascinating. This wasn't considered unusual or problematic. It wasn't a sleep disorder. It wasn't something people worried about or tried to fix. It was simply how sleep worked. Imagine, if you will, life before electricity, before gas lamps, before even widespread candle use in ordinary homes. We're going back to a time when darkness was truly dark, when the night stretched long and deep and black, broken only by moonlight, starlight, or the faint glow of a carefully tended fire. In this world, your life moved with the sun in ways we can barely comprehend today. When daylight faded, there wasn't much you could do. You couldn't simply flip a switch and flood your home with light. Candles and oil were expensive, precious resources, not to be wasted. Work that required good vision, sewing, reading, detailed crafts, became impossible or impractical. So what did people do? They went to bed, not because they were necessarily exhausted, but because, well, what else was there to do in the dark? But here's the thing, they didn't stay asleep all night. Not in one stretch. Historical documents, diaries, prayer books, medical texts, literature from the Middle Ages through the 18th century. All of these sources contain something curious. They reference what was called first sleep and second sleep, or sometimes first nap and second nap. These weren't casual phrases or rare mentions. They appeared again and again across different countries, different languages, different centuries. Writers used these terms naturally, without explanation, suggesting that everyone knew exactly what they meant. It was common knowledge, part of the shared experience of being human. People would go to bed relatively early, often just a few hours after sunset, perhaps around 8 or 9 in the evening by our modern clock time. They would sleep for 3 or 4 hours. This was the first sleep. And then they would wake up. Not because of an emergency. Not because of a crying baby or a nightmare or indigestion. They would simply wake. Naturally. And this was expected. Normal. What did they do during this waking period? This is where it gets really interesting and rather beautiful. The period between first sleep and second sleep, often lasting 1 to 2 hours, became a special time. A gift of quiet hours in the middle of the night. Some people would lie in bed, reflecting on their dreams, which were often still vivid and fresh. They would think, pray, meditate. Some would talk quietly with their spouses or family members, sharing a sleeping space. It was considered an especially intimate time for conversation, for connection. Others would get up. They might tend to the fire, use the privy, check on animals. Some would do light tasks, prepare food for the morning, brew herbal teas, or engage in quiet activities that didn't require much light. Many historical references suggest this was considered an ideal time for prayer and spiritual contemplation. Some religious texts even contain special prayers specifically meant for the middle of the night. And then, when they felt ready, after an hour, sometimes 2, people would return to sleep. The second sleep would carry them through until dawn. This wasn't just a European phenomenon, by the way. Evidence suggests similar patterns existed in various forms across different cultures and climates around the world, wherever humans lived without artificial light and industrial schedules. In some societies, particularly in warmer climates, the pattern was different but still segmented. The intense heat of midday made work difficult or dangerous. So people developed a rhythm that included sleeping during the hottest part of the afternoon, what we might call a siesta, and then being active in the cooler evening hours, sometimes late into the night. Sleep was divided between nighttime rest and daytime napping. Among certain groups, especially those living closer to the equator or in nomadic traditions, sleep schedules were even more fluid. People would sleep when tired, wake when rested, with less rigid division between day and night activities. The elderly might nap more. Young children certainly did. Adolescents might stay up later and sleep later. There was flexibility, adaptation to individual needs and circumstances. The key point is this: the idea that humans should sleep one continuous 7 to 8 hour block, timed to roughly the same schedule every night, with waking in the middle of the night treated as abnormal. This idea simply didn't exist for most of human history. Sleep was something you did multiple times. It was woven throughout the day and night in patterns that made sense for the season, the climate, the work that needed doing, and your body's natural rhythms. And nobody worried about it. Nobody tracked it. Nobody rated it or tried to optimize it. There were no sleep studies, no sleep hygiene tips, no anxiety about whether you were doing it right. You simply slept when you were tired, in the pattern that your body, your community, and your environment suggested. And somehow, it worked. Now, you might be wondering, when did this change? How did we get from that flexible, segmented sleep to our modern obsession with the 8-hour block? The answer is complicated, unfolding over several centuries. But we can trace the beginning of the shift to a few key developments. First came artificial light. Not the electric light bulbs we know today. That came later, but earlier forms. Better candles, oil lamps, gas lighting in cities. Each innovation pushed back the darkness a little more, extending the hours when people could see well enough to work, socialize, and be productive. As light became cheaper and more accessible, the evening hours changed. You no longer had to go to bed when the sun set simply because there was nothing else to do. You could read. You could work. You could socialize. The boundary between day and night began to blur. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and everything accelerated. Factories needed workers to show up at the same time. Assembly lines couldn't function if people wandered in whenever they felt rested. Trains ran on schedules. Telegraph systems operated around the clock in shifts. The modern economy demanded synchronization, standardization, efficiency. Sleep, like everything else, needed to be rationalized, optimized, made to fit the needs of industry and commerce. The segmented sleep of previous centuries, with its long periods of nighttime wakefulness, didn't fit this new world. It was inefficient. If workers were awake in the middle of the night, they might as well be working. And if they were going to work all day, they needed to sleep all night. One shift, one sleep. Gradually, over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the old pattern faded. First in cities, where artificial light was brightest and factory work most common. Then slowly spreading outward, as industrial time colonized more and more of human life. By the mid-20th century, references to first sleep and second sleep had vanished from common language. The pattern was forgotten. Within just a few generations, it was as if it had never existed at all. And in its place rose our modern ideal: 8 hours, continuous, consolidated into the night. Sleep became medicalized, studied in laboratories, broken down into stages and cycles. Doctors began to diagnose sleep disorders, conditions defined largely by deviation from this new, consolidated pattern. Waking in the middle of the night, which had once been perfectly normal, became middle insomnia or sleep maintenance insomnia. Something to treat, to fix. We invented alarm clocks to force ourselves awake at the right time. Sleep aids to keep ourselves asleep all night. Entire industries arose around achieving this elusive 8-hour block of uninterrupted rest. And here we are today. Most of us trying desperately to sleep the way we think we're supposed to, believing this is how humans have always slept, how we're designed to sleep. But we're not. That restless period at 2 or 3 in the morning, when you wake and can't immediately fall back asleep. When you lie there wondering what's wrong with you, why you can't sleep like a normal person. Maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe your body is remembering something your conscious mind has forgotten. Maybe you're experiencing an echo of first sleep and second sleep, a vestige of the way humans slept for thousands of years. Maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're just historically accurate. Let that thought settle over you now, gently, like a soft blanket. There's nothing wrong with you. Your sleep doesn't have to look like everyone else's. It doesn't have to conform to an 8-hour ideal that's barely a century old. Sleep, like so many things, has a history. And that history is far richer, far more varied, far more forgiving than we've been led to believe. As you drift now, perhaps toward your own first sleep of the night, you can let go of the anxiety. Let go of the rules. Your body knows what it needs. It carries within it thousands of years of wisdom about rest, about darkness, about the natural rhythms of waking and sleeping. Trust it. Trust yourself. And rest easy, knowing that however you sleep tonight, you're part of a long, long history of humans finding their own way through the night. Now that we've glimpsed the truth, that our modern sleep is not the eternal human pattern we thought it was, let's travel deeper into the past. Let's explore what sleep actually looked like for our ancestors, what it felt like, how it shaped their nights and their days. We're going to step back into the pre-industrial world, a world lit by fire and starlight. A world that moved to rhythms we've almost entirely forgotten. Breathe deeply, relax, and let your imagination carry you backward through time. In the centuries before factories and offices, before electric grids and 24-hour convenience stores, human life followed patterns dictated by something we rarely think about today. The natural cycle of light and darkness. This might seem obvious. Of course, people were more affected by daylight and nightfall when they didn't have artificial lighting. But it's worth really considering what this meant in practice. How profoundly different life was when the sun didn't just influence your schedule. It was your schedule. In pre-industrial societies, across virtually all cultures and climates, sleep was not a single event. It was not something you did once per day, in one consolidated block. Instead, sleep occurred in multiple bouts scattered across the 24-hour cycle. Think of it like eating. We don't eat just once a day in one enormous meal. We eat multiple times: breakfast, lunch, dinner, perhaps snacks in between. Our ancestors approached sleep with similar flexibility. It was something you did when your body needed it, when circumstances allowed it, in whatever pattern made sense for your life. The specific patterns varied enormously depending on where you lived and what you did for a living. A farmer in Northern Europe experienced very different seasonal light patterns than a merchant in North Africa. A coastal fisherman timed his sleep around tides and weather as much as around daylight. A mother with young children grabbed sleep whenever she could. But beneath all this variation, there was a common thread. Sleep was broadly biphasic or polyphasic. Multiple periods. Not one. Some of the earliest evidence for this comes from the ancient Mediterranean world. The civilizations that flourished around the Mediterranean Sea, the Greeks, the Romans, the early Christian communities, the Islamic empires, left behind writings that give us windows into their daily lives. And when you read these texts carefully, you find references to sleep patterns that don't quite match our modern assumptions. Ancient physicians wrote about sleep as something that occurred in stages, with natural interruptions. They considered it normal for sleep to have texture, to have breaks in it. Early religious texts contain references to nighttime prayers that seem to assume people would be awake in the deep hours of the night. Not because they were devout insomniacs, but because waking in the middle of the night was simply what people did. Some scholars who study these ancient sources argue that the pattern of segmented nighttime sleep, the first sleep, wakeful period, and second sleep that we discussed earlier, might reach back at least to Greco-Roman times, perhaps even earlier. We can't be entirely certain, because people didn't write in detail about something so ordinary as how they slept. It would be like us writing detailed instructions about how to use a doorknob, too obvious to mention. But the clues are there. Scattered references, casual mentions, the kind of evidence that suggests something was so common, so universally understood, that it needed no explanation. As we move forward in time, however, the evidence becomes much clearer, much more detailed, and the picture it paints is fascinating. By the medieval period in Europe, roughly the years 500 to 1500 CE, we have abundant documentation of exactly how people slept. And the pattern is unmistakable. Medieval Europeans followed what historians now call segmented sleep. And this wasn't a minor variation on modern sleep. It was fundamentally different, structured differently, experienced differently. Here's how it worked. As evening fell, families would gather in their homes. In peasant cottages, this might mean everyone in 1 or 2 rooms. In wealthier households, there might be more space, but still, people lived in much closer quarters than we do today. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. The evening hours, after the day's work was done, but before full darkness settled, were social time. People would eat their evening meal. They might tell stories, sing songs, play simple games. Children might be taught skills by their parents. Neighbors might visit. This was precious time, the only real leisure most people had. But as true darkness descended, and it became difficult to see even with whatever small flame might be burning, a candle, an oil lamp, a fire, there wasn't much to do. Remember, light was expensive. Most families couldn't afford to burn candles all evening. Fire required constant tending and fuel. And in darkness, you simply couldn't do most tasks safely or effectively. So people went to bed, often quite early by our standards. In winter, when darkness came as early as 4 or 5 in the afternoon in northern latitudes, people might be in bed by 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. But here's the key. They didn't expect to stay asleep all night. They would settle in, often in beds shared with family members. In colder climates, multiple people might share a bed for warmth. They would fall asleep, lulled by the sounds of the settling household, the crackle of a dying fire, perhaps the wind outside. This first period of sleep, documented in sources across Europe, was called by various names. In English, first sleep or dead sleep. In French, premier sommeil. In Italian, primo sonno. The terminology varied, but the concept was universal. This was the initial period of nighttime rest, and people would sleep deeply. 3 hours, sometimes 4. This first sleep was characterized by its depth, its restorativeness. The body dropped into profound rest. Then, somewhere around midnight, though remember, most people didn't have clocks, so it was more a feeling, an instinct, they would wake. Not suddenly, not with alarm, just a natural surfacing into wakefulness, like coming up from deep water, slowly, easily. And this is where medieval life reveals something beautiful, something we've lost. This wakeful period in the middle of the night, this interval between first sleep and second sleep, was not an anxious time. It was not spent tossing and turning, worrying about not sleeping. It was not considered a problem to be solved. Instead, it was a gift, a special time, perhaps the only time in a medieval person's busy, labor-intensive, community-oriented life when they had something approaching solitude and quiet. What did people do during this hour or two of wakefulness? The historical record gives us many answers, and they paint a vivid picture. Many people stayed in bed, warm under their covers, and simply thought. They reflected on their dreams, which were often still vivid and present, hovering at the edge of consciousness. Dreams were taken very seriously in medieval culture, considered messages, omens, insights from God or the spiritual realm. This quiet time was ideal for contemplating what your dreams might mean. Prayer was extremely common during this interval. Not rushed, hurried prayer, but deep contemplative communion with the divine. Many prayer books from the medieval period contain specific prayers meant for the middle of the night. These weren't emergency prayers or prayers for insomniacs. They were regular prayers, part of the expected rhythm of a Christian's day. Or night, rather. Monasteries and convents structured their entire schedules around these nighttime wakings. Monks would rise for matins, nighttime prayers, around midnight or 1 in the morning. This wasn't a special discipline imposed by monastic life. The monks were simply formalizing and communalizing what ordinary people did naturally in their own beds. Wake in the middle of the night and turn their thoughts to God. But it wasn't all solemn and religious. Far from it. Many historical documents suggest that the interval between first and second sleep was considered an especially good time for intimacy between spouses. The privacy of darkness, the relaxation that comes after several hours of sleep, the quiet of the house, all of these made this a natural time for connection. Some medieval medical texts even recommended this timing for conception, believing that the body was in an optimal state after first sleep. People talked, quietly, so as not to wake others, but they talked. Husbands and wives would have conversations that couldn't happen during the busy day. They would discuss problems, make plans, share thoughts. In a world where couples often worked from dawn to dusk, with little time for private conversation, this nighttime interval was precious. Some people would get up. Not far, remember, most homes were small, and it was dark, but they might move about. They would check the fire, add wood if needed, to ensure the house stayed warm through the cold hours of early morning. They might use the chamber pot or visit an outhouse. In rural areas, people might check on livestock, especially in winter when animals needed extra care. Others did light work. By the glow of banked coals or a small candle, people might prepare food for the next day. Women might do simple sewing or mending that didn't require perfect visibility. Some people would write, and we actually have letters and diary entries from various periods that explicitly mention being written during the watch of the night or between first and second sleep. There are records of people visiting neighbors during this time, though this was less common. But it happened enough to be mentioned in legal documents and literature. Someone might walk through the dark village to a friend's house to continue a conversation from earlier in the day, or to check on someone who was ill. Thieves apparently operated during this interval too. Court records and legal documents from medieval England contain references to burglaries committed between first and second sleep, suggesting that criminals understood this was a time when people would be awake, but still in their homes, a unique window for certain kinds of crime. The point is, this wakeful period was normal, so normal that society adapted to it, expected it, built it into the rhythm of life. And here's something remarkable. This pattern wasn't unique to Europe. Not at all. As historians and anthropologists began researching sleep in other cultures, they found similar patterns all over the world. The specific details varied, but the core concept, segmented sleep, multiple periods of rest, nighttime waking as a natural phenomenon, appeared again and again. In parts of Africa, traditional societies showed patterns of broken nighttime sleep. People would wake, tend to fires, talk, then sleep again. In some regions, the pattern was even more fluid, with sleep happening whenever it was needed, without strict timing. The Middle East, with its long history of scholarship and record-keeping, also shows evidence of segmented sleep. Islamic prayer times include the tahajjud, an optional pre-dawn prayer that historically was often performed after a period of sleep, followed by more sleep before fajr, the obligatory dawn prayer. This suggests a pattern of sleeping, waking for prayer in the deep night, then sleeping again, remarkably similar to the European pattern of first sleep, wakeful period, and second sleep. In South Asia, historical records and traditional practices suggest similar patterns. The intense heat of the day in many regions made midday sleep essential, creating a biphasic pattern of nighttime rest and daytime napping. And within the nighttime rest, there was often natural segmentation, periods of waking and sleeping. Indigenous peoples in the Americas, when studied by anthropologists before their traditional lifestyles were too disrupted by colonization, often showed flexible, segmented sleep patterns. Without artificial light or rigid schedules, people slept when tired and woke when rested, creating natural rhythms that didn't match the consolidated 8-hour block. Even today, in communities that lack electricity or have only recently acquired it, researchers sometimes find remnants of these older patterns. People naturally tend towards segmented or flexible sleep when not constrained by industrial schedules and artificial lighting. What this tells us is profound. The pattern of segmented sleep, of first sleep and second sleep, of natural nighttime waking, wasn't some quirk of medieval Europe. It wasn't a cultural oddity or a learned behavior specific to one time. Darkness falls, and it is dark. Not the semi-darkness of modern nights, with streetlights and lit windows and the constant glow of the city, but true darkness. Thick, velvety, complete. You climb into bed, maybe a simple straw mattress, maybe a wooden frame with blankets, depending on your means. Your spouse is beside you, perhaps a child or two. The house settles into quiet. Someone coughs. The fire crackles. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. And you sleep. Deeply. Completely. For 3 or 4 hours, you are gone, dropped into the profound rest that comes from physical exhaustion and the absence of mental stimulation that characterizes pre-modern life. Then you surface. Gently. You're awake, but not anxious. You don't check a clock because you don't have one. You don't worry about getting back to sleep because you know you will. This is just what happens. You lie there in the darkness, listening to your family breathe. You think about the next day's work, but without stress. You remember a dream, something about your father who died last year. The dream felt important. You turn it over in your mind, looking for meaning. Your spouse stirs, also awake. You talk quietly about your daughter, who's of marriageable age. There's a young man from the next village who seems interested. Is he a good match? You discuss it in whispers. This decision is important, and during the busy day, there's never time for such careful conversation. After a while, maybe an hour, maybe 2, you feel sleep returning. A gentle drowsiness. Your spouse has already drifted off mid-sentence. You smile in the darkness, adjust your position, and let yourself sink back into rest. This second sleep will carry you until dawn, until the rooster crows, until light seeps through the cracks in your shutters, and it's time to rise and begin the day's work. This is how humans slept. For centuries. For millennia, perhaps. Not anxiously. Not with sleep trackers and optimization strategies. Not with medication or concern about sleep hygiene. Just naturally. Following the body's rhythms. Trusting the pattern that has served humanity since long before we built cities or invented clocks or decided that sleep should happen all at once. And here's what's truly remarkable. By all accounts, people were well rested. They didn't complain about sleep deprivation the way we do today. Yes, life was hard, exhausting in ways we can barely imagine. But sleep itself wasn't a problem. It wasn't something that needed to be fixed or optimized or worried about. It was just sleep, in its natural, segmented human form. As you continue to relax now, sinking deeper into your own rest, you might consider this. Your body remembers this pattern. Somewhere in your cells, in your genes, in the ancient parts of your brain that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, this segmented sleep is still encoded. When you wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, you're not experiencing a malfunction. You're experiencing an echo, a whisper from the past. Your body, reverting for a moment to its natural state, unshackled from the demands of modernity. There's something profoundly comforting in that, isn't there? You're not broken. You're not failing at sleep. You're just human. Beautifully, historically, authentically human. Let that thought wrap around you now, like a warm blanket. Let it ease any anxiety you might carry about your sleep. You are connected to countless generations of humans who slept in rhythms and patterns as varied as their lives. And they were fine. They rested. They thrived. And so will you. Rest now. First sleep, second sleep, or any pattern your body chooses. It's all natural. It's all human. It's all perfectly, wonderfully okay. We've spent time in medieval Europe, walking through those dark villages, lying awake between first sleep and second sleep. But now, let's step back. Let's widen our view. Because this story, the story of human sleep, is so much bigger than one continent, one culture, one time period. The segmented sleep we've been exploring wasn't a European invention. It wasn't even particularly European at all. It was human, universal, or nearly so. And when we look at the full scope of human societies across the globe, we find something remarkable. Everywhere people lived without electric light and industrial schedules, sleep looked fundamentally similar. Flexible, broken, natural. Let's travel the world together now. Let's visit communities across Africa, Asia, the Americas, Australia. Let's see how humans everywhere found their own rhythms with rest and wakefulness, patterns shaped by their environments, their climates, their cultures, but all sharing a common thread of flexibility that we've almost entirely lost. Take a deep breath, relax more deeply, and let's begin this journey. We'll start in Africa, that vast and diverse continent where humanity itself was born, where our earliest ancestors first opened their eyes to consciousness, first looked up at the stars, first wondered about the nature of sleep and dreams. In pre-industrial African societies, and we're talking about hundreds of different cultures, each with their own traditions and ways of life, historical records and ethnographic studies reveal patterns of sleep that mirror what we saw in medieval Europe, but with their own distinct flavors. Travelers, missionaries, anthropologists, and colonial administrators who visited African communities before electricity arrived often wrote about how people slept. And their accounts, when we read them carefully, describe segmented nights. People going to bed soon after dark, waking in the middle of the night, activity during these wakeful hours, then returning to sleep. In some West African communities, the period of nighttime wakefulness was used for storytelling and education. Elders would gather with young people and pass down oral histories, teach traditional knowledge, share the stories that held the community's identity and values. The darkness, the quietness of the deep night, created a special atmosphere for this sacred transmission of culture from one generation to the next. In East African pastoral societies, where people's lives revolved around their cattle, nighttime wakefulness served practical purposes. Men would wake to check on the herds, ensure they were safe from predators, move them if needed. This wasn't a disruption to sleep. It was part of sleep's rhythm. Rest, wake, tend to what matters, return to rest. In many African communities, sleeping arrangements were communal. Extended families shared sleeping spaces, multiple generations together. And in this context, fragmented sleep wasn't just normal, it was necessary. Babies cried. Children had nightmares. Elders needed assistance. Someone was always waking, always needing something. And rather than treating this as a problem, as an interruption to proper sleep, communities adapted. Sleep was understood to be flexible, accommodating, woven through the needs of the group. Now let's travel east, to the Middle East, that ancient crossroads of civilizations where so much of human history unfolded. The Middle East has given us some of the world's oldest written records, and among those records are references to sleep that reveal patterns remarkably similar to what we've been discussing. Islamic tradition, which emerged in the 7th century and spread across a vast region, incorporated into its religious practices an understanding of sleep that suggests segmented nights were the norm. The 5 daily prayers of Islam include Fajr, the dawn prayer, which must be performed before sunrise. But there's also Tahajjud, an optional night prayer that devout Muslims perform in the last third of the night. Historically, the typical pattern was to sleep after the Isha prayer, the night prayer, performed after sunset, wake naturally in the deep hours of the night for Tahajjud, and then return to sleep before rising for Fajr at dawn. Does this sound familiar? First sleep after nightfall, wakeful period for prayer and contemplation. Second sleep before dawn. The same pattern we saw in medieval Europe, but here integrated into religious practice, given spiritual significance. In the hot climates of much of the Middle East, another pattern developed that was equally important: the afternoon rest. When the sun blazed at its peak, when the heat became oppressive and even dangerous, people rested. They retreated to the shade, to cool rooms, and they slept. This wasn't laziness or indulgence. It was survival. It was wisdom. This created a biphasic rhythm. Substantial sleep at night, substantial sleep in the afternoon. 2 main periods of rest in every 24 hours. And again, this was normal. Expected. Buildings were designed with this in mind, with cool interior rooms perfect for afternoon napping. Work schedules accommodated it. Society flowed around these dual periods of rest. Let's continue east, to South and Southeast Asia, regions of tremendous cultural diversity and ancient civilizations. In India, historical texts going back thousands of years discuss sleep in ways that suggest multiple periods of rest were understood and accepted. The ancient medical system of Ayurveda, which dates back at least 3,000 years, describes sleep as something that varies by individual constitution, by season, by stage of life. It doesn't prescribe a single correct way to sleep. Instead, it acknowledges diversity and flexibility. The concept of the siesta, though we usually associate that word with Spanish and Latin American cultures, has parallels across South Asia. The midday rest during the hottest hours. The division of sleep between night and day. In agricultural communities throughout the Indian subcontinent, this pattern was standard. Work in the cool of early morning, rest during the scorching midday, work again in the late afternoon and evening, then nighttime sleep. Often segmented, often interrupted by the sounds and needs of large, multi-generational households. In Southeast Asia, where the climate is hot and humid year-round, similar patterns emerged. Anthropologists studying traditional communities in Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, and other countries have documented sleep that is flexible and distributed. People sleep when they're tired, wake when they're rested, or when something needs attention. The rigid 8-hour block simply doesn't appear in traditional lifestyles. And there's something else in these communal Asian societies. The acceptance of noise and activity during sleep hours. Unlike the modern Western ideal of absolute silence and darkness for sleep, many Asian cultures expected that sleep would happen amid the sounds of life. People talking quietly, children playing, elders moving about. Sleep wasn't fragile, something that could only happen under perfect conditions. It was robust, woven into the texture of continuous community life. Now let's travel even further, to Australia, where indigenous peoples have lived for more than 65,000 years, the longest continuous culture on Earth. Aboriginal Australian communities, before European colonization disrupted their traditional ways of life, had sleep patterns that were perhaps even more fluid than what we've discussed so far. Anthropologists who studied these communities in the early 20th century, before traditional lifestyles had been entirely destroyed, documented sleep that was opportunistic, flexible, deeply attuned to the environment. In the harsh climates of much of Australia, the intense heat, the cold desert nights, people adapted their sleep to thermal comfort as much as to darkness and light. On hot nights, people might sleep very lightly, waking frequently, only dropping into deeper sleep in the cooler hours before dawn. On cold nights, people would huddle together around fires, sleeping in shifts, so that someone always tended the flames. There was no clock watching, no concern about getting exactly the right amount of sleep. Instead, there was trust in the body's wisdom, in the group's collective rhythm. If you were tired, you slept. If you woke, you woke. Someone was always awake, tending to something, keeping watch. And this was good. This was safe. Crossing the Pacific now, to the Americas, we find similar patterns repeated across vast distances and diverse cultures. When European explorers, missionaries, and colonizers first encountered indigenous peoples throughout North, Central, and South America, they often commented on sleep patterns that seemed strange to European eyes. But reading these accounts now, with our understanding of segmented sleep, they make perfect sense. Native American communities across the continent showed flexible, often segmented sleep. People would sleep, wake, move about, then sleep again. The specific patterns varied enormously depending on climate, lifestyle, and cultural practices, but the flexibility was constant. Among the Inuit peoples of the Arctic, where seasonal light patterns are extreme, months of continuous daylight in summer, months of continuous darkness in winter, sleep became even more disconnected from any standard schedule. People slept when tired, in multiple bouts, adapting to the extraordinary environment they inhabited. The very concept of night sleep versus day sleep became meaningless when the sun never set or never rose. In the Amazon basin, anthropologists have studied communities like the Tsimane people of Bolivia, who still maintain relatively traditional lifestyles. What they've found is fascinating and important for our understanding of natural human sleep. The Tsimane sleep an average of only about 5.7 to 7 hours per night, much less than the 8 hours we're told we need. But they also nap. They also wake frequently during the night. Their sleep is fragmented, flexible, woven through their days and nights in a pattern that serves them well. And crucially, they don't complain of sleep deprivation. They don't suffer from the epidemic of tiredness that plagues modern industrial societies. Similar findings have come from studies of other hunter-gatherer and small-scale agricultural societies around the world. The Hadza people of Tanzania, the San people of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. Again and again, researchers find the same patterns. Shorter total sleep than modern recommendations suggest is necessary, multiple periods of sleep and waking, napping when possible, and, importantly, someone usually awake at any given time. That last point is particularly interesting. In these small communities, the fact that people's sleep is staggered, that not everyone sleeps at exactly the same time, appears to serve important functions. It aids in safety, with someone always able to notice approaching danger. It helps with childcare, with someone always available to tend to a crying infant or restless child. It creates a sense of continuous community presence, even through the darkest hours. This staggered sleep, this natural variation in when individuals sleep and wake, might actually be one of humanity's evolutionary adaptations. We've evolved not to all sleep at once, but to maintain a rhythm of overlapping rest and wakefulness that benefits the group. How different this is from our modern notion that everyone should be asleep from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., that there's something wrong with you if you're a night owl or an early bird. In all of these societies, African, Middle Eastern, Asian, Australian, American, we also see the profound influence of climate on sleep patterns. This is so important, yet we rarely think about it in our climate-controlled modern homes. In hot climates, the siesta isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. When temperatures soar to dangerous levels in the middle of the day, continuing to work is harmful, potentially deadly. The body needs to conserve energy, to rest in shade, to wait for cooler temperatures. So sleep divides naturally into night rest and midday rest. Biphasic sleep driven by thermal survival. In some tropical regions, the pattern goes even further. People might sleep lightly through the hot night, take a substantial nap in the afternoon, and then be most active in the evening when temperatures drop. Sleep becomes polyphasic, multiple distinct periods, shaped entirely by the demands of climate. And in cold climates, sleep was often communal by necessity. Bodies clustered together for warmth. Fires tended throughout the night, requiring people to wake periodically. The isolation of individual bedrooms, of each person sleeping alone in their own temperature-controlled space, is a very modern luxury. For most of human history, in most of the world, sleep was a shared experience. This communal aspect of sleep is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's so different from how most of us sleep today, and it profoundly affected the nature of sleep itself. Imagine sleeping in a space with 10 or 15 other people. Multiple generations. Babies, children, adults, elders. Some snoring. Some restless. Babies crying. Children having nightmares. Elders needing to get up to use the privy. Constant small noises and movements. In this environment, you cannot have the kind of deep, uninterrupted sleep we idealize today. It's simply not possible. So people didn't expect it. They didn't strive for it. Instead, they developed the ability to sleep lightly when needed, to rouse partially at sounds and disturbances, to assess whether intervention was needed, and then to return to sleep easily. Sleep became something flexible, responsive, social. Not a private, isolated, protected state, but a communal activity woven through the life of the group. And in this context, waking in the middle of the night wasn't abnormal or problematic. It was simply part of how sleep worked when you lived closely with others. You woke, you checked that everyone was okay. Perhaps you had a quiet conversation with someone else who was awake. You tended to whatever needed tending. And then you went back to sleep. No anxiety. No feeling that you were doing it wrong. Just acceptance that this is how human sleep works in human communities. What all of these global patterns tell us, from Africa to Asia to Australia to the Americas, is that the flexibility we've been discussing isn't culturally specific. It's not something that just medieval Europeans did. It's what humans do, everywhere, when we're not constrained by artificial light and industrial time. The specific details vary. Some cultures emphasize nighttime segmentation more. Others emphasize the biphasic pattern of night sleep plus afternoon napping. Some cultures develop more flexible, polyphasic patterns with multiple shorter periods of sleep distributed across 24 hours. But the underlying principle is universal. Humans are flexible sleepers. We adapt our sleep to our environment, our climate, our social structures, our individual needs. We don't naturally conform to a rigid, consolidated 8-hour block. And crucially, when we sleep in these flexible, natural ways, we seem to be fine. More than fine. Communities that maintained these traditional sleep patterns before modern life disrupted them showed no evidence of sleep deprivation, no epidemic of tiredness, no complaints about not getting enough rest. The sleep they got, fragmented, distributed, flexible as it was, served them well, sustained them, allowed them to thrive in every climate and environment humans have inhabited across this planet. As you rest now, continuing to relax, sinking deeper, you might feel a sense of connection. Connection to all these humans, across all these places, across all these times. All of us sleeping in our own ways. All of us finding rhythms that work for our lives, our bodies, our circumstances. There's no one right way to sleep. There never has been. The 8-hour consolidated block we've been told is normal, is necessary, is the standard of health, That's the anomaly. That's the strange outlier in human history. Your body knows this. Your body carries within it the wisdom of all those ancestors, sleeping under African stars, resting in Asian heat, waking between first sleep and second sleep in every corner of the globe. Trust that wisdom. Trust that flexibility. Trust that however your sleep naturally wants to pattern itself, segmented, biphasic, polyphasic, or even sometimes consolidated, it's probably fine. It's probably exactly what your particular body, in your particular life, needs. You are part of a global human story of sleep. And it's a far richer, far more varied, far more forgiving story than we've been told. Rest in that knowledge. Rest in that freedom. And let sleep come however it will. We've traveled far together. We've seen how humans slept across the globe, in patterns as diverse as the cultures themselves, but all sharing that fundamental flexibility, that trust in the body's natural rhythms, that acceptance of segmented, broken, multi-phased rest. But now, our story takes a turn. Not a sudden, dramatic shift. Not yet, but a quiet beginning. A slow transformation that would eventually change everything about how humans sleep. The years between 1500 and 1700, what historians call the early modern period, were a time of tremendous change in Europe. The medieval world was fading. Something new was emerging. And in the midst of all this change, so subtle that few noticed it happening, the ancient patterns of human sleep began to shift. Let's settle in and explore this transformation. How it began, why it happened, and what it meant for the sleep of millions. Take a breath, relax, and let's step into this pivotal period of history. At the start of the 1500s, across most of Europe, people still slept much as their ancestors had for centuries. The pattern of first sleep and second sleep remained strong. Court records, personal diaries, medical texts, religious writings, all continued to reference this segmented pattern as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Which of course it was. A historian named Roger Kirch spent years, decades, really, combing through historical documents from this period. He examined thousands of sources, court records where crimes were dated between first and second sleep, diaries where people recorded dreams from their first sleep or activities during their nighttime wakefulness, medical texts advising when to take certain medicines or perform certain treatments relative to first or second sleep. Literature where characters naturally referred to these sleep periods without explanation. Kirch found hundreds upon hundreds of references. The evidence was overwhelming. In the 1500s, in the 1600s, even into the 1700s, segmented sleep was still the norm for much of the European population. But, and this is important, Kirch and other scholars who've studied this period also note something else. The pattern wasn't absolutely universal. It never had been, actually. Even in earlier centuries, there was variation. Some people, in some circumstances, slept in longer, more consolidated blocks. Others maintained the segmented pattern. Individual differences, seasonal changes, lifestyle factors, all of these created variation. But what begins to happen in this early modern period is that the variation starts to tilt. Gradually, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, more people begin sleeping in longer, less segmented stretches. The old pattern doesn't disappear. Not yet, but it starts to fade for certain groups in certain places. Why? What changed? The answer is complex, woven from multiple threads of transformation that were remaking European society. Let's pull apart these threads one by one and examine them. First, there was urbanization. Cities began to grow, not yet to the massive industrial centers they would become, but noticeably larger than they had been in the medieval period. London, Paris, Amsterdam, Rome, Madrid. All of these cities expanded, drawing people from the countryside. And city life was different from rural life in crucial ways that affected sleep. In a medieval village, when darkness fell, there was genuine darkness. Few could afford more than minimal lighting. Everyone went to bed because there was simply nothing else to do. The rhythm of rural agricultural life enforced rest. But in growing cities, especially among the merchant classes and the wealthy, evening activities expanded. Taverns and inns provided spaces for socializing after dark. For those who could afford candles or oil lamps, the evening became a time for reading, for entertaining guests, for conducting business. Urban homes, built closer together than rural cottages, meant that noise and activity from neighbors might penetrate your sleeping space, disrupting the deep quiet that had previously characterized the night. The city, in other words, began to colonize the darkness. Slowly, incompletely, but measurably. Wealthier urban residents might stay up later, not until midnight by modern standards, but later than their rural counterparts. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and if you didn't go to bed until later, you might sleep through in a longer block rather than waking in the middle of the night, as you would if you'd gone to bed at 7 or 8. This wasn't yet a wholesale transformation. Most people, even in cities, still maintained older patterns. But among certain groups, the wealthy, the urban elite, merchants, and professionals, a shift was beginning. The second thread of change involved the nature of evening social life. In the medieval period, evening socialization happened within the home or the immediate community. You might visit a neighbor, gather with family, but activities were limited by darkness and proximity. But in the early modern period, new forms of evening entertainment began to emerge. Theatre became increasingly popular in cities. In London, playhouses opened and drew crowds in the late afternoon and early evening. In Italy and France, opera began to develop. Coffee houses appeared, first in the Ottoman Empire, then spreading to European cities by the mid-1600s, creating new spaces for evening social and intellectual life. For those who participated in these activities, again, primarily urban dwellers with means, the evening stretched later. The day didn't end at sunset. It extended into the darkness, lit by candles and lamps, filled with culture and conversation. And naturally, if your evening activities kept you up later, your sleep pattern shifted. You went to bed later, and sleeping later into the night meant less likelihood of waking for a long middle-of-the-night interval. The timing simply didn't align as neatly with the segmented pattern. The third thread involves religion and the changing nature of religious practice. This is more subtle, but no less important. In the medieval period, as we discussed, nighttime prayer was common. The interval between first and second sleep was seen as an ideal time for communion with God. Monasteries structured their entire days around multiple prayer times, including prayers in the deep night. But the Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517, brought significant changes to religious practice in much of Northern Europe. Protestant theology emphasized a more direct, personal relationship with God, less mediated by the ritual structures of the Catholic Church. While prayer remained important, the elaborate schedule of prayer times became less central in Protestant regions. This didn't eliminate nighttime prayer, but it reduced the cultural reinforcement of nighttime wakefulness as a spiritual activity. And without that reinforcement, without the cultural script saying, "It is natural and good to wake in the night for prayer," people might have interpreted their nighttime wakings differently, as disturbances rather than opportunities. Meanwhile, in Catholic regions, the Counter-Reformation brought its own changes, including shifts in how religious life was structured for ordinary lay people versus clergy. The monastic rhythm of nighttime prayers remained for monks and nuns, but for the general population, religious practice became somewhat more consolidated into specific times, particularly Sunday Mass and morning and evening prayers. Again, these changes were gradual and uneven, but they contributed to a slow erosion of the cultural framework that had supported segmented sleep. The fourth thread, perhaps the most significant for what was to come, involved work routines and the beginning of more standardized time. In the medieval and early modern rural world, work followed natural rhythms. You worked when there was light and when the season demanded it. Planting time, harvest time, animal tending, all of these followed their own schedules. Time was task-oriented. You worked until the task was done, then you rested. You slept when tired. But in growing cities, particularly among craftspeople and merchants, work was beginning to become more regularized. Guilds set standards for apprentices and journeymen. Shops opened at certain times. Markets operated on schedules. Time was becoming more standardized, more measured, more regulated. This was still a far cry from the factory clock discipline that would come with industrialization. But it was a beginning. And as work schedules became more regular, sleep schedules began to follow. If you needed to open your shop at a certain time each morning, you needed to ensure you were awake and rested at that time. This created pressure toward more predictable, more consolidated sleep. Clocks themselves became more common during this period, though still rare and expensive. Mechanical clocks began to appear in public spaces, on church towers, in city centers. Time, which had previously been approximate and flexible, was becoming more precisely measured and more publicly known. You didn't yet organize your personal life by clock time the way we do today, but the infrastructure for that organization was being built. The cognitive shift toward thinking about time as measurable, divisible, manageable, that shift was beginning. All of these threads, urbanization, evening social life, changing religious practices, regularizing work schedules, the emergence of measured time, wove together to create a subtle but growing pressure against the old pattern of segmented sleep. And yet, and this is crucial, segmented sleep did not disappear. Not even close. For the vast majority of Europeans, the peasants and agricultural workers, who still constituted the overwhelming bulk of the population, life continued much as it had for centuries. They went to bed early. They woke in the night. They slept again before dawn. The old pattern persisted because the old conditions persisted. No artificial light. No urban entertainments. No clock-regulated schedules. Just the sun, the seasons, and the rhythms of agricultural labor. Even in cities, even among the groups experiencing change, many people maintained segmented sleep. The references a Kirch found in documents from the 1600s and early 1700s make this clear. People still naturally talked about first sleep and second sleep, still structured their nights around that pattern, still experienced it as normal. What was happening in this period wasn't a transformation so much as the very beginning of one. A crack appearing in an ancient structure, a loosening of a pattern that had held firm for millennia. If you could somehow interview a person from 1650, from almost anywhere in Europe, and ask them how they slept, most would describe something recognizable as segmented, or at least highly flexible sleep. The midwife up at all hours tending to births. The farmer sleeping deeply after exhausting labor, waking to tend the fire, sleeping again. The merchant's wife, comfortable in her urban home, perhaps staying up a bit later with candles to do fine needlework, but still experiencing nighttime wakefulness as normal. But if you interviewed that same person's grandchild in 1700, you might notice subtle differences. Maybe they'd mention going to bed a bit later. Maybe they wouldn't reference first and second sleep quite as automatically. Maybe, if they were urban and prosperous, they'd describe sleep that was starting to look a bit more consolidated, a bit more like what would eventually become the modern pattern. The change was slow, generational, easy to miss if you were living through it. You probably wouldn't wake up one day and think, "Oh, my sleep has changed." It would just gradually shift. The way languages change over centuries, with each generation speaking slightly differently than the last, until eventually the accumulated differences create something new. And what's interesting, what's worth really reflecting on as you continue to relax here, perhaps drifting toward your own sleep, is that this change wasn't driven by any new understanding of health or biology. It wasn't because people discovered that consolidated sleep was better for you. There was no scientific breakthrough, no medical advance. It was driven entirely by social and economic changes, by urbanization, by new forms of evening entertainment, by the slow, early stages of capitalism creating more regularized work schedules, by the Protestant Reformation altering religious practices, by mechanical clocks beginning to impose a new way of thinking about time. Sleep changed because society changed, not because humans changed. Our biology remained the same. Our bodies still carried the ancient patterns, still wanted to wake in the night, still benefited from flexibility. Persisted because the old conditions persisted. No artificial light, no urban entertainments, no clock-regulated schedules, just the sun, the seasons, and the rhythms of agricultural labor. Even in cities, even among the groups experiencing change, many people maintained segmented sleep. The references a Kirch found in documents from the 1600s and early 1700s make this clear. People still naturally talked about first sleep and second sleep, still structured their nights around that pattern, still experienced it as normal. What was happening in this period wasn't a transformation so much as the very beginning of one. A crack appearing in an ancient structure, a loosening of a pattern that had held firm for millennia. If you could somehow interview a person from 1650, from almost anywhere in Europe, and ask them how they slept, Most would describe something recognizable as segmented, or at least highly flexible sleep. The midwife up at all hours tending to births. The farmer sleeping deeply after exhausting labor, waking to tend the fire, sleeping again. The merchant's wife, comfortable in her urban home, perhaps staying up a bit later with candles to do fine needlework, but still experiencing nighttime wakefulness as normal. But if you interviewed that same person's grandchild in 1700, you might notice subtle differences. Maybe they'd mention going to bed a bit later. Maybe they wouldn't reference first and second sleep quite as automatically. Maybe, if they were urban and prosperous, they'd describe sleep that was starting to look a bit more consolidated, a bit more like what would eventually become the modern pattern. The change was slow, generational, easy to miss if you were living through it. You probably wouldn't wake up one day and think, "Oh, my sleep has changed." It would just gradually shift. The way languages change over centuries, with each generation speaking slightly differently than the last, until eventually the accumulated differences create something new. And what's interesting, what's worth really reflecting on as you continue to relax here, perhaps drifting toward your own sleep, is that this change wasn't driven by any new understanding of health or biology. It wasn't because people discovered that consolidated sleep was better for you. There was no scientific breakthrough, no medical advance. It was driven entirely by social and economic changes, by urbanization, by new forms of evening entertainment, by the slow, early stages of capitalism creating more regularized work schedules, by the Protestant Reformation altering religious practices, by mechanical clocks beginning to impose a new way of thinking about time. Sleep changed because society changed, not because humans changed. Our biology remained the same. Our bodies still carried the ancient patterns, still wanted to wake in the night, still benefited from flexibility. But slowly, gradually, the world we had built around ourselves began to demand something different from our sleep. And we began, without really deciding to, without really understanding what we were losing to comply. This is just the beginning of the story, of course. The real transformation, the dramatic shift that would sweep away thousands of years of sleep patterns in just a few generations, that was still to come. That would require industrialization, electric light, and a complete reimagining of time itself. But here, in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, we can see the first stirrings. The quiet beginning of change. The moment when an ancient human pattern began, slowly to fade. And perhaps there's something melancholy in that. Something lost. But perhaps there's also something useful in understanding it. In recognizing that our modern sleep difficulties didn't arise because we suddenly became bad at sleeping. They arose because we built a world that conflicts with our natural rhythms. And what can be built can potentially be rebuilt differently. But that's a thought for another time. For now, as you rest, as you allow sleep to come in whatever pattern it chooses tonight, segmented or consolidated, early or late, long or short, you can take comfort in knowing that you're part of this long, complex, fascinating human story of sleep. A story that spans millennia, that crosses continents, that connects you to countless humans who've lain awake in the darkness, just as you might be doing now, wondering about rest and wakefulness, about dreams and dawn. You're not alone in this. You never have been. And your sleep, however it manifests, is valid. Human. Part of the ongoing story of how we rest and how we wake. Let that knowledge settle over you now like a gentle blanket. Let it ease any worry, any anxiety, any sense that you should be sleeping differently than you do. You're fine. You're human. You're part of an ancient pattern that's still alive within you, no matter what the modern world demands. Rest now, in whatever way feels right. First sleep, second sleep, or something entirely your own. All of it is natural. All of it is human. All of it is perfectly, beautifully okay. We've reached the turning point now. The moment when everything changed. When the slow, quiet transformations we discussed, the gradual shifts, the small adjustments, suddenly accelerated. When an ancient pattern that had served humanity for millennia was swept away in just a few generations. This is the story of how we lost segmented sleep. How the modern world was built on top of our natural rhythms, burying them so deeply that we forgot they ever existed. It's a story of factories and clocks, of cities growing beyond recognition, of time itself being reimagined, restructured, weaponized in service of productivity. Breathe deeply. Settle in. This part of our journey is important. Sometimes understanding what was lost helps us make peace with what remains. Let's begin. The 1700s dawned on a Europe that was still, in many ways, recognizably medieval. Most people lived in the countryside. Most worked with their hands, in rhythms determined by seasons and daylight. Most slept in patterns their grandparents would have recognized. But beneath the surface, massive changes were building. Changes that would transform not just how people worked, but how they lived, how they thought about time, and yes, how they slept. The Industrial Revolution, that great transformation that shifted human civilization from agricultural to industrial, from rural to urban, from muscle power to machine power, is usually dated to the late 1700s in Britain, spreading to other parts of Europe and North America through the 1800s. But to understand how industrialization changed sleep, we first need to understand what industrialization actually meant. Not in abstract economic terms, but in the lived experience of ordinary people. What it felt like, how it restructured daily life. Before industrialization, most people worked in agriculture or small-scale crafts. A farmer's day was long and often exhausting, but it was also flexible. If you needed to rest in the afternoon, you could. If you woke in the night and couldn't sleep, you could lie there peacefully, knowing no clock was ticking down to a mandatory start time. Your work was tied to tasks, planting, harvesting, milking, repairing, not to hours on a timesheet. The same was true for craftspeople. A weaver, a blacksmith, a carpenter. These people worked according to the demands of their craft and their customers. Busy seasons alternated with slow seasons. Long workdays alternated with shorter ones. You worked until the work was done, then you rested. But factories were different. Fundamentally, radically different. A factory was built around machines. And machines had their own logic, their own demands. A water wheel turned at a constant rate. A steam engine ran continuously once fired up. The looms and spinning machines powered by these engines needed to run as many hours as possible to be profitable. Stopping and starting them was inefficient, wasteful. So factories demanded that human workers adapt to the rhythm of machines. Not the other way around. This meant fixed hours. rigid schedules. If the factory started at 6 in the morning, you needed to be there at 6. Not when you felt rested. Not when you'd finished your morning tasks. At 6. Precisely at 6. And the factory day was long. Often 12 hours. Sometimes 14, or even 16 in the early, brutal days of industrialization. 6 days a week. Sometimes 7. These were not hours that allowed for any flexibility in sleep. You couldn't wake in the middle of the night for an hour or two of reflection and prayer, then sleep again if you needed to be at the factory by 6. You needed to maximize your nighttime sleep, to compress all your rest into the hours between returning home exhausted and leaving again in the dark morning. Napping during the day became impossible for factory workers. There were no afternoon siestas, no brief rests when the heat grew oppressive or energy flagged. You were at your machine, at your station, for the entire shift. The machine didn't rest, so neither could you. This was a shock to people's systems, to their bodies, to their entire understanding of rest and work. Imagine being a first-generation factory worker. Perhaps you grew up on a farm, sleeping in the segmented pattern your family had followed for generations. Waking naturally in the night, tending to the fire, saying prayers, talking quietly with your spouse, then drifting back to sleep. Working in the fields during daylight, resting when you needed to. And then, because of economic necessity, because enclosure laws pushed you off the land, because you needed wages to survive, you found yourself in a factory, in a massive building that shook with the thunder of machines, breathing air thick with cotton fibers or coal dust, standing for 12 hours, performing the same repetitive task again and again and again. Your body still wanted to wake in the night, still carried those ancient patterns, but you couldn't afford to honor them. If you woke at 2 in the morning, you couldn't lie there peacefully for an hour. You had to try desperately to fall back asleep, because you needed every minute of rest you could get before that 6 o'clock bell rang. Sleep became something different, not a natural rhythm to flow with, but a resource to maximize, something to be efficient about, something to discipline yourself into doing correctly. And the factory owners and managers actively reinforced this new relationship with sleep. They instituted strict punctuality rules. If you were late, you were fined. If you were very late, you might be fired. If you fell asleep on the job, exhausted from impossibly long hours and inadequate rest, you could be beaten, fined, or dismissed. Time discipline. That's what historians call it. The training of workers to internalize clock time, to regulate their entire lives, including their sleep, according to the demands of industrial production. Before the factory, most working people didn't own clocks. They didn't need them. The sun and the seasons told them what they needed to know. But now, suddenly, you needed to know exactly what time it was. Had to organize your sleep, your meals, your entire life around clock time. Factory towns installed large public clocks. Church bells rang to mark the factory shift changes. Some factories employed knocker-uppers, people whose job was to go through the workers' neighborhoods in the early morning, tapping on windows with long poles to wake people for their shifts. Your sleep was no longer private, personal, natural. It was supervised, regulated, monetized. And it wasn't just factory workers who experienced this transformation. As industrialization progressed, its logic spread throughout society. Office workers faced similar demands for punctuality and fixed hours. Shopkeepers adjusted their hours to match the factory workers' schedules. Even domestic servants in wealthy households found their work increasingly regulated by clock time. The entire society was reorganizing itself around industrial time. And sleep had to reorganize too. Cities grew explosively during this period. London, Manchester, Paris, New York, all swelled with workers drawn from the countryside, crammed into tenements and boarding houses. And city life further eroded the old sleep patterns. Cities were noisier than villages. Much noisier. Factories ran late into the evening. Taverns and public houses served workers seeking relief from their brutal labor. Cart traffic, street vendors, domestic noise from thin-walled housing, all created a soundscape that made traditional sleep more difficult. Cities were also more lit than ever before. First with gas lighting, which began to appear on city streets in the early 1800s, then eventually with electric lighting toward the end of the century. The deep, complete darkness that had characterized human nights for all of history began to fade. You could see this in people's evening habits. With better lighting, first gas, later electricity, and with the development of evening entertainments like music halls, theaters, and later cinemas, people stayed up later. Not just the wealthy, but working-class people too, seeking entertainment and social life after their long workdays. The evening expanded. People went to bed later. And going to bed later meant less time for segmented sleep. If you went to bed at 10 or 11 instead of 7 or 8, and you still needed to wake at 5 or 6 for work, your sleep naturally consolidated. There simply wasn't time for the long middle-of-the-night wakeful period that had characterized first and second sleep. Through the 1700s and into the 1800s, this transformation accelerated. What had been a slow drift became a rapid shift. The old patterns crumbled. By the early 1800s, historical references to first and second sleep began to disappear. Not slowly, but relatively quickly. Within a generation or two, language that had been common for centuries vanished from everyday speech. People stopped talking about first sleep because they weren't experiencing it anymore. The segmented pattern had been squeezed out of existence by industrial demands. Historians place the main transition from biphasic or segmented nights to consolidated, monophasic sleep somewhere between the late 17th century and the early 19th century. The exact timing varied by location, by social class, by urban versus rural setting. But broadly speaking, this is when it happened. When humanity's ancient sleep pattern was replaced by something new. By the mid-1800s, in industrialized Western Europe and North America, the classic two-sleep system, that distinctive pattern of first sleep, wakeful interval, and second sleep, was largely abandoned. It hadn't completely disappeared. Some rural areas maintained it longer. Some individuals continued to experience it. But it was no longer the norm. No longer the expected pattern. No longer the thing everyone knew and accepted. In its place was something different. Something that would have been foreign to your great-great-great-grandparents. A single, consolidated block of nighttime sleep. 7 to 8 hours, ideally. All at once. Without waking. This was the new ideal. The new normal. The thing you were supposed to do if you wanted to be a productive, proper, respectable member of industrial society. And if you couldn't do it, If you woke in the night and couldn't fall back asleep? If your body stubbornly insisted on following older rhythms? Well, then something was wrong with you. You had a sleep problem, a disorder, something that needed to be fixed. The medical establishment began to take interest in sleep during this period, not to understand humanity's natural patterns, but to help people conform to industrial demands. Doctors began diagnosing insomnia, defined largely as the inability to maintain continuous nighttime sleep. They prescribed various treatments, medications, behavioral changes, all aimed at helping people achieve that consolidated 8-hour block that industry required. No one seemed to ask whether this new pattern was actually natural for humans, whether our bodies were designed for it, whether we might be forcing ourselves into a mold that didn't quite fit. The assumption was that if the new industrial society needed consolidated sleep, then consolidated sleep must be correct, natural, healthy, and any deviation from it must be pathological. This is a pattern we see again and again in history. Economic demands get reframed as biological imperatives. If capitalism needs workers to show up at 6 in the morning, then waking at 6 must be the natural, healthy thing to do. If factories need continuous labor without afternoon breaks, then humans must not really need afternoon naps. If industrial productivity requires consolidated nighttime sleep, then segmented sleep must be abnormal. But biology doesn't work that way. Evolution doesn't care about factory schedules. Our bodies carry patterns developed over hundreds of thousands of years. You can't erase that in a few generations just because a new economic system demands it. And yet, in a way, we did erase it. Or at least, we buried it so deeply that almost everyone forgot it existed. By the late 1800s, people in industrialized societies genuinely believed that humans had always slept the way they now slept. One block, 7 to 8 hours, at night. Anything else was aberrant. The collective memory of segmented sleep was lost. The language disappeared. The practice faded. And within just a few generations, it was as if it had never existed at all. This is how quickly culture can change. How quickly something universal can become invisible. How quickly we can forget who we were, what our bodies want, what our ancestors knew. And here's what makes this particularly poignant. The new pattern didn't work as well. People struggled with it. They complained of poor sleep, of insomnia, of restlessness. But because everyone believed this was how humans were supposed to sleep, they blamed themselves. Not the system. Not the unnatural demands. Themselves. Sound familiar? Even today, in our modern world, we tend to blame ourselves when we can't achieve perfect sleep. We must be doing something wrong. Too much caffeine. Too much screen time. Poor sleep hygiene. Not enough exercise. Too much stress. We rarely ask whether the very framework, the expectation of consolidated nighttime sleep in a world of artificial lighting and rigid schedules, might be the problem. But that's exactly what happened in the 1700s and 1800s. A framework was imposed. A new pattern demanded. And people struggled to conform to it, often believing that their struggle represented personal failure rather than a fundamental mismatch between human biology and industrial capitalism. There's something both tragic and fascinating in this history. Tragic because of what was lost, not just a sleep pattern, but a whole way of relating to rest to darkness, to time itself. Fascinating because it reveals how malleable human culture is, how quickly we can adapt to new circumstances, even when that adaptation comes at a cost. As you rest now, perhaps feeling the pull of sleep yourself, consider this. The anxiety many of us feel about sleep, the concern about waking in the night, the desperate pursuit of perfect 8-hour blocks. All of this is very new. Historically speaking, incredibly new. For most of human history, people didn't worry about sleep the way we do. They just slept, in whatever pattern their bodies and their circumstances created. And that was fine. The worry, the anxiety, the medicalization of sleep, these came with industrialization, with the demand that our bodies conform to rigid schedules, with the transformation of rest from a natural rhythm into a productivity requirement. Understanding this doesn't immediately solve our modern sleep challenges. We still live in the world that industrialization built. We still have jobs with start times and responsibilities that demand we be alert at specific hours. But perhaps understanding the history creates a bit of space, a bit of permission, to recognize that your body's resistance to the imposed pattern isn't a personal failing. It's a whisper from your evolutionary past, a reminder that humans aren't machines, despite what the Industrial Revolution tried to make us. Your sleep is your own, and whatever form it takes, even if it doesn't match the ideal, even if it seems broken by modern standards, it's connected to something ancient, something real, something deeply human. Rest in that knowledge. Let it ease the worry, and allow sleep to come in whatever form it chooses. First sleep, second sleep, or something entirely shaped by our modern world. It's all part of the long, complex story of human rest. And you are part of that story. Always have been. Always will be. We've seen how factories and clocks reshaped sleep. How industrial demands crushed the ancient flexibility of human rest into a rigid, consolidated block. But there was another force at work. Another transformation that would prove just as powerful, just as revolutionary. Light. For all of human history, from our first ancestors looking up at the stars to your great-great-grandparents in the early 1800s, night was dark. Truly, deeply dark. Yes, there were candles and oil lamps and fires. But these were small lights. Precious. Expensive. They pushed back the darkness a little, created small circles of illumination, but they didn't fundamentally change the night. And then, quite suddenly in historical terms, everything changed. Humanity learned to manufacture light, to create it abundantly, cheaply, brightly, to extend the day indefinitely into what had always been the domain of darkness. And when the night grew lighter, our sleep grew shorter, more compressed, more squeezed into fewer hours. The ancient pattern collapsed under the weight of illumination. Let's explore this transformation together. This theft of darkness, this conquest of night. Breathe slowly, settle deeper, and let's watch as humanity's relationship with darkness changes forever. The story begins with gas. Natural gas, or town gas, as it was often called, manufactured from coal, started being used for lighting in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The technology developed gradually, but by the 1810s and 1820s, gas lighting was beginning to appear on the streets of major European and American cities. London was an early adopter. Paris followed. New York. Philadelphia. Boston. One by one, cities installed gas lamps on their main streets, creating pools of steady, bright light that had never existed before. This was revolutionary. Genuinely revolutionary. For the first time in human history, public spaces could be illuminated reliably and extensively after dark. Streets that had been dangerous and forbidding at night became navigable. Businesses could stay open later. Entertainment venues could operate into the evening. The night, which had always belonged to sleep and danger and mystery, suddenly became an extension of the day. A time for commerce, for social life, for activity. Initially, gas lighting was mainly a public phenomenon. Street lighting. Lighting for theaters and public buildings. Factories used gas lighting to extend the workday, squeezing even more hours out of their workers. But gas lighting in private homes was expensive and required infrastructure. Not everyone had access. But even this partial illumination of the night began to change sleep patterns, especially in cities. If the streets were lit, people could safely move about in the evening. They could visit friends, attend entertainments, shop, socialize. The evening became a viable part of the social day, rather than just a brief transition between daylight and sleep. And so, bedtimes began to creep later. Not dramatically at first. Maybe an hour, maybe 2, but enough to disrupt the old pattern. Remember, segmented sleep worked partly because people went to bed so early, often just a few hours after sunset, around 7 or 8 in the evening. This early bedtime meant sleeping 3 or 4 hours, then waking naturally around midnight for that wakeful interval, then sleeping again until dawn. But if you're staying out until 9 or 10, enjoying the newly lit streets and evening entertainments, and then going home to bed, the timing doesn't work the same way. You might sleep until 2 or 3 in the morning before waking, and then you only have a few hours until you need to rise for work. There's no room for a long, leisurely wakeful period. You need to fall back asleep immediately to maximize your rest. So the pattern begins to compress. The wakeful interval shrinks. First sleep and second sleep blur together. And gradually, for more and more people, they merge into one. This was happening through the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. Unevenly. In cities more than rural areas. Among the middle and upper classes, more than the poor. But the trend was clear. Gas lighting was extending the day and shortening the night, and sleep was changing as a result. But gas lighting, transformative as it was just the beginning. The real revolution was yet to come. In 1879, Thomas Edison patented his incandescent light bulb. He didn't invent electric lighting. Others had created arc lamps and various electric lights before him. But Edison created a practical, affordable, long-lasting electric bulb that could be mass-produced and widely adopted. And then he created the infrastructure to support it. Power stations, distribution systems, wiring. By the 1880s, parts of New York City had electric lighting. By the 1890s, it was spreading to other cities. By the early 1900s, electric lighting was becoming common in urban areas across the industrialized world. Electric light was different from gas light. Brighter, cleaner, safer, no risk of gas leaks or explosions. More controllable. You could turn it on and off with a switch rather than having to light and extinguish individual lamps. And cheaper to operate. at least once the infrastructure was in place. Most importantly, electric light was abundant. It could be everywhere. Every room in a house. Every street in a city. Every shop, office, factory, theater. The amount of light humanity could generate suddenly became limited only by how much power we could produce and how many bulbs we could manufacture. And we produced a lot. The night began to vanish. By the 1920s and 1930s, in urban areas of wealthy industrialized nations, many homes had electric lighting. Streets were brightly lit. Businesses stayed open late under brilliant electrical illumination. Entertainment districts blazed with lights. Times Square in New York, Piccadilly Circus in London, the Champs-Élysées in Paris. These places became famous precisely because they were so bright, so alive with light at night. The darkness that had governed human life since the beginning was retreating, and with it, the sleep patterns that darkness had shaped. Think about what this meant in practical, lived terms. Imagine you're a person living through this transformation. Maybe you were born in 1880, before electric lighting was common. Your childhood evenings were dim, lit by gas lamps or kerosene, and you went to bed relatively early because there wasn't much you could do after dark. But by the time you're 40, in 1920, you have electric lights in your home. Bright, clean, reliable. You can read easily at night. Do detailed work. Your children can do homework in their bedrooms. You can stay up as late as you want, and the night is as bright as day at the flick of a switch. How do you use this new power? Well, naturally, you stay up later. You read more. You work more if you need to. You socialize more. You take advantage of evening entertainment. Movies, which are just becoming popular, require artificial lighting to project and can be shown at any hour. Radio broadcasts, which begin in the 1920s, provide evening entertainment at home. The evening expands from a brief transition period into a full part of the day. Some people start thinking about the day as having 3 parts: morning, afternoon, and evening, each with its own character, its own activities. Evening becomes prime time for leisure and relaxation after work. And as the evening expands, sleep contracts. If you're staying up until 10, 11, midnight, and you still need to wake at 6 for work, you're getting 6 hours. Maybe 7 if you're disciplined about getting to bed. But not the 8 or 9 hours of total sleep, split between first sleep and second sleep, that might have been available when people went to bed at dusk. The opportunity for segmented sleep effectively disappears. There's simply no time for it. Your sleep becomes consolidated by necessity. One block, compressed, maximized for efficiency. And here's what's particularly interesting. People generally didn't see this as a loss. The rhetoric around electric lighting was almost entirely positive. It was progress, modernity, civilization. The conquest of darkness was framed as a triumph of human ingenuity. There were some dissenters. Some doctors warned that late hours and too much evening activity might be unhealthy. Some moralists worried that brightly lit entertainment districts encouraged vice and idleness. Some poets and philosophers mourned the loss of darkness, of starry skies, of the mystery and quiet of night. But these voices were overwhelmed by the enthusiasm for electric light. The idea that we might be losing something important, a natural relationship with darkness, a healthier pattern of rest, barely registered in the public consciousness. Instead, the narrative was about what we were gaining. Productivity. The ability to work and study and create without being limited by daylight. Safety. Lit streets were safer than dark ones. Entertainment and culture. Theaters, sports venues, restaurants, all could operate into the night, enriching urban life. Connection. Electric lighting made it easier to maintain social connections in the evening, to have dinner parties, to visit friends, to participate in community activities after work. These gains were real. Electric lighting genuinely did improve life in many ways. But there was a cost too. A cost measured in sleep, in the loss of darkness, in the disruption of circadian rhythms that had evolved over millions of years to respond to natural light and darkness. Our bodies don't know that electric light is artificial. When bright light enters our eyes, our brains interpret it as daylight. Melatonin production, the hormone that helps us feel sleepy, is suppressed. Our circadian rhythms shift. We become alert when perhaps we should be winding down. Even with relatively dim lighting by modern standards, the early electric bulbs weren't as bright as what we have now. This effect was noticeable. People could stay alert and active much later into the evening than had ever been possible before. And so bedtimes drifted later and later. In the 1920s, sleep researchers began to notice that people were sleeping less than they had in previous generations. The average amount of sleep was declining. Not dramatically. We're talking about perhaps an hour or 90 minutes less than in pre-industrial times. But measurably. Some researchers worried about this. Was modern society creating a sleep deficit? Were people getting enough rest? But the dominant response was to medicalize the issue. If people weren't sleeping well, they needed help sleeping. The solution wasn't to question whether electric lighting and modern schedules might be the problem. The solution was to develop better sleeping pills, to give advice about sleep hygiene, to help people adapt to the new conditions. Sleeping pills became increasingly popular in the early 20th century. Barbiturates, first synthesized in the 1860s, became widely prescribed for insomnia by the 1900s and 1910s. People were chemically forcing themselves to sleep in ways and at times that didn't align with their natural rhythms. But this was seen as modern medicine solving a problem, not as a symptom of a larger issue with how we'd structured our relationship to time and light. The compression of sleep into a single, shorter, later block continued through the 20th century. Each generation stayed up a bit later than the last. Each new technology, first radio, then television, then computers, then smartphones, created new reasons to remain active in the evening. New sources of bright light to suppress melatonin and keep us alert. By the late 20th century, in wealthy industrialized nations, the average bedtime had drifted to somewhere around 11 p.m. or midnight. Wake times remained early. Most people still needed to be at work or school by 8 or 9 in the morning. This left 7 or 8 hours for sleep, sometimes less. The old pattern of segmented sleep, with its 9 or 10 hours of total rest divided into 2 periods with a wakeful interval between, was completely forgotten, utterly absent from cultural memory. People had no idea it had ever existed. And the night itself, the deep, dark night that humans had experienced for hundreds of thousands of years, that was fading too. Light pollution from cities now makes it impossible to see the stars in most urban and suburban areas. The Milky Way, which every single one of your ancestors throughout history would have seen regularly, is now invisible to the majority of humans on Earth. We've quite literally lost the night, replaced it with something else, something brighter, busier, more productive, but also something fundamentally different from the environment in which human sleep evolved. And we wonder why we struggle to sleep, why so many of us lie awake at night, anxious, alert, unable to achieve the perfect consolidated rest we think we should be getting. Perhaps the problem isn't with us. Perhaps it's with the environment we've created. An environment flooded with artificial light. An environment that treats darkness as a problem to be solved, rather than a natural condition to be honored. Our bodies are designed for darkness. Real darkness. The kind that tells your brain unambiguously that it's time to produce melatonin, time to slow down, time to rest. The kind that allows for waking in the night without bright light immediately signaling that it's day and you should be alert. But we live in a world where darkness is increasingly rare, where light is constant, available, inescapable, and we pay a price for that in our sleep. As you rest now, in whatever darkness you've been able to create around yourself, blackout curtains, perhaps, or an eye mask, or just the natural darkness of a room at night, consider how precious that darkness is, how rare it's become, how different your experience is from your ancestors, who lived immersed in darkness every single night. And if you wake in the night, if you find yourself alert in the small hours, perhaps don't immediately reach for your phone with its bright screen. Don't turn on lights. Don't treat the waking as a problem to be immediately solved. Maybe, just maybe, allow yourself a moment of connection with the darkness, with the ancient human experience of nighttime wakefulness. Even if you can't recreate the full pattern of segmented sleep, even if your schedule and your environment don't allow it, you can honor the impulse, the body's memory of another way. Lie there in the dark. Let your thoughts drift. Connect with something older than electric lights and industrial schedules, something that connects you to every human who ever woke in the night and simply existed there in the quiet and the dark. And then, when you're ready, let yourself drift back to sleep. Not anxiously, not desperately, but naturally. The way humans have done for millennia, even in these compressed, consolidated, artificially shortened nights. The darkness is still there, underneath all our light. Your body still knows it, still responds to it, still needs it. Give yourself that gift. The gift of darkness. The gift of rest that doesn't need to be perfect or optimized or measured. Just rest. In the darkness. In the quiet. In the ancient human way. However much or little sleep comes, it's enough. You're enough. Your sleep is enough. Let that truth settle over you now, gentle and sure as the darkness itself. And rest. We've traveled far together through this history. We've seen how segmented sleep slowly faded, how factories and clocks restructured time, how artificial light pushed back the darkness. All of these forces, working together, compressed and consolidated human sleep into something new. But there's one more piece to this story. One final transformation that locked the new pattern into place and made it feel not just normal, but natural, inevitable, the only correct way to sleep. This is the story of how monophasic sleep became an ideal. a moral imperative, a measure of health and civilization. How a pattern born from industrial demands became reimagined as biological necessity, medical wisdom, and cultural progress. Settle deeper now. Let your breathing slow. And let's explore how a new ideal was born and spread across the world, shaping how billions of humans think about rest. By the early 1800s, as we've discussed, the classic pattern of first sleep and second sleep had largely disappeared from urban areas in Western Europe and North America. But something important happened next. Something that goes beyond just people changing their behavior out of necessity. The new pattern, consolidated, monophasic sleep, became codified, standardized, elevated from "this is how we sleep now because of factories and lighting" to "this is how humans are supposed to sleep." This transformation happened through several overlapping channels: medical discourse, labor politics, public health campaigns, educational institutions, all working together, mostly unconsciously, to create and reinforce a new ideal. Let's start with medicine. In the 1800s, medicine was becoming increasingly professionalized and scientific. Doctors were beginning to study the body systematically, to create standards for health, to define what was normal versus pathological. And as they turned their attention to sleep, they did so with assumptions shaped by their own time and culture. They themselves slept in consolidated blocks, because that's what their industrial society demanded. And so, quite naturally, they assumed this must be the healthy, normal way to sleep. Medical texts from the 19th century began to describe sleep as something that should be continuous and uninterrupted. Waking in the middle of the night, which had been completely normal for all of human history up until very recently, was now defined as a problem, a symptom, something that needed treatment. The term insomnia took on its modern meaning during this period. Previously, insomnia had referred to a complete inability to sleep, a rare and serious condition. But in the 19th century, it began to be applied much more broadly. If you woke during the night and couldn't immediately fall back asleep, you had insomnia. If you slept in a segmented pattern, you had insomnia. If you didn't sleep a solid 7 or 8 hours, something was wrong with you. Doctors began prescribing treatments for these sleep disorders. Medications first, various sedatives and sleeping potions, but also behavioral advice. Go to bed at a regular time. Keep your bedroom dark and quiet. Don't read or work in bed. Avoid stimulating activities in the evening. All advice aimed at helping people achieve that ideal of continuous, consolidated sleep. None of this advice was based on any deep understanding of how human sleep had worked throughout history. How could it be? The doctors themselves had no idea that segmented sleep had existed. They were only a few generations removed from their ancestors who had practiced it, but the cultural memory was already gone. So they created theories based on what seemed logical given their assumptions. They believed consolidated sleep was natural, so any deviation must be caused by modern stresses, poor habits, or underlying disease. The idea that the consolidated pattern itself might be the aberration, that their insomnia patients might actually be experiencing echoes of an older, healthier pattern. This idea was never considered. Medical authority gave the new sleep ideal enormous weight. If doctors said consolidated sleep was healthy and necessary, then it must be true. People trusted medical expertise. They wanted to sleep correctly. And so they tried harder and harder to achieve the pattern that medicine defined as normal, even when their bodies resisted. At the same time, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the labor movement was gaining strength. Workers were organizing, fighting for better conditions, shorter hours, fair treatment. And one of their most powerful slogans became, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. This formula, dividing the 24-hour day into 3 equal parts, became a rallying cry for labor reforms across the industrialized world. It was elegant, simple, fair-sounding. 8 hours for your employer, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for yourself, for family, leisure, personal pursuits. The movement achieved significant victories. The 8-hour workday became standard in many industries and countries through the early 20th century. This was genuine progress. Workers had been laboring 12, 14, even 16 hours a day. 8 hours was a huge improvement. But notice what this formula did to sleep. It codified 8 hours as the correct, ideal amount of rest. Not 7. Not 9. Not however much your body needs. 8. Precisely 8. A number chosen for its arithmetic convenience, for how neatly it divided the day, not for any biological reason. And 8 hours meant consolidated sleep. You worked your 8-hour shift. You had 8 hours for other activities. Then you slept 8 hours in one block, and the cycle started again. There was no room in this formula for segmented sleep, for napping, for flexible patterns. The day was divided into 3 neat boxes, and sleep fit into one of them. Labor movements promoted this ideal with the best of intentions. They were fighting for workers' well-being. But in doing so, they reinforced the industrial pattern as natural and optimal. The 8-hour sleep block became not just a practical necessity, but a right, something workers deserved and should fight for. This political dimension added to the moral weight of the new sleep ideal. Sleeping 8 hours in one block wasn't just medically advised. It was socially progressive. Modern. Fair. The mark of a civilized society that respected its workers. Public health institutions picked up and amplified these messages. As governments began to take more responsibility for public health in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they launched campaigns to educate people about healthy living. And sleep was part of that education. Public health posters, pamphlets, school curricula, all began to include messages about the importance of 8 hours of sleep. Children were taught from a young age that they needed 8 hours, or more for young children, of continuous nighttime sleep to be healthy. This was presented as scientific fact, as settled knowledge. Schools structured their schedules around this ideal. Start times were set assuming children would get their 8 hours of sleep and wake at a certain time. Homework was assigned with the expectation that it would be completed in that 8-hour, what we will period, not cutting into the sacred 8 hours of sleep. Employers similarly organized work schedules around 8-hour sleep. Start times, shift patterns, productivity expectations, all assumed workers were getting their full 8 hours of consolidated rest. The entire structure of modern industrial society was built around monophasic sleep. And once that structure was in place, it became self-reinforcing. People needed to sleep in consolidated blocks to function in this world. And because everyone was sleeping this way, it seemed natural. Normal. The only way. By the early 20th century, the transformation was complete. Monophasic sleep, one consolidated block of 7 to 9 hours at night, had become the cultural norm across industrialized societies. It was what doctors recommended, what schools taught, what employers expected, what nearly everyone practiced, and crucially, it was what everyone believed humans had always done. The historical memory of other patterns had vanished so completely that the new way seemed eternal, unchanging, biologically ordained. Sleep medicine, which emerged as a distinct field in the mid-20th century, was founded entirely on this assumption. When researchers began studying sleep in laboratories in the 1950s and 1960s, monitoring brain waves and discovering REM sleep and sleep cycles, they did so with subjects who slept in consolidated blocks. And so naturally, they described sleep architecture in terms of a single night's sleep. The stages and cycles they identified were patterns within monophasic sleep. They didn't study segmented sleep because they didn't know it existed. They described the sleep of modern, industrialized humans living under artificial lighting with regulated schedules, and they called it simply human sleep, as if it were universal and timeless. This scientific framing gave the new ideal even more authority. Now it wasn't just cultural or medical opinion. It was backed by laboratory research, by brain scans, by objective measurement. 8 hours of consolidated sleep was the biological norm for humans. Science said so. The textbooks were written. The diagnostic criteria were established. The treatments were developed. An entire edifice of sleep medicine was constructed on the foundation of monophasic sleep as the human standard. And yet, there were always cracks in this edifice, always evidence that didn't quite fit. Some cultures never fully adopted monophasic sleep. The siesta tradition in Spain, Latin America, and parts of the Mediterranean maintained a biphasic pattern. Nighttime sleep plus a substantial afternoon nap. This was often dismissed by Northern Europeans and Americans as a quaint cultural practice, perhaps a necessary adaptation to hot climates, but not quite as advanced or efficient as pure monophasic sleep. But the siesta countries never gave it up, despite pressure toward industrialized patterns. People knew instinctively that it worked for them, that the afternoon rest was valuable, restorative, natural. Indigenous communities around the world, those that maintained traditional lifestyles, continued to show flexible, often segmented or polyphasic sleep patterns. Anthropologists documented this, but tended to frame it as traditional or primitive, implying it was something that would naturally be replaced by modern sleep patterns as societies developed. The assumption was that monophasic sleep represented progress, evolution, the pinnacle of sleep sophistication. Anything else was a holdover from less developed times. But then, in the 1990s, something interesting happened. A researcher named Thomas Wehr conducted an experiment. He took modern American subjects, people who normally slept in consolidated 8-hour blocks, and put them in conditions of natural lighting. 14 hours of darkness each night, mimicking winter night length. No electric lights, no artificial stimulation, and after a few weeks, something remarkable occurred. The The subjects spontaneously reverted to segmented sleep. They would sleep for about 4 hours, wake for 1 to 3 hours, lying peacefully in the darkness, often reporting feeling deeply calm and meditative during this time. Then sleep again for another 4 hours. First sleep and second sleep. The pattern that had supposedly vanished, that had been forgotten, that modern sleep medicine didn't even acknowledge as real. It came back, naturally, when the artificial constraints were removed. This study was fascinating, even revolutionary. It suggested that segmented sleep wasn't just a historical curiosity or a cultural practice. It was a biological pattern, something deeply embedded in how human sleep works, something that would still emerge in the right conditions. But interestingly, this research didn't change much about how sleep medicine or public health approached sleep. The study was published, discussed in academic circles, noted as interesting, and then largely set aside. The structures built around monophasic sleep were too entrenched. The entire modern world functioned on the assumption of consolidated sleep. One fascinating laboratory experiment couldn't change that. So here we are today, living in a world where 8 hours of consolidated sleep is still the ideal, where waking in the night is still considered a problem, where the entire structure of work, school, and social life assumes everyone sleeps the same way, at the same times, in the same pattern. And millions of people struggle with this. Lie awake at night, anxious, frustrated that they can't achieve the sleep they think they should be getting. Take sleeping pills. Try endless sleep hygiene tips. Blame themselves for their bad sleep. Meanwhile, their bodies might simply be remembering, trying to express older patterns, waking between first and second sleep, wanting to nap in the afternoon, following rhythms that don't fit the modern ideal, but that are deeply, authentically human. The ideal we've been given is powerful. It shapes how we think about ourselves, our health, our adequacy as modern people. If we can't sleep correctly, we feel we're failing, falling short, somehow broken. But what if the ideal itself is the problem? What if the standard we're measuring ourselves against is historically anomalous, biologically awkward, culturally imposed rather than naturally emerging? As you rest now, perhaps feeling the edges of sleep approaching, consider what freedom there might be in releasing that ideal, in recognizing it for what it is, a recent construction, built from industrial needs and medical assumptions, not a timeless truth about human nature. Your sleep doesn't have to look like anyone else's, doesn't have to fit the 8-hour mold, doesn't have to be perfectly consolidated, uninterrupted, optimized. It just has to be yours, your body's pattern, your rhythm, your way of moving through rest and wakefulness. The ideal is powerful, yes. It's everywhere, reinforced constantly. But it's also just an idea. And ideas can be questioned, examined, released when they no longer serve us. You carry within you ancient patterns of sleep, patterns that served humans well for thousands of generations. Those patterns don't disappear just because modern society built a different structure around them. They're still there, still available, still valid. Trust them. Trust yourself. Trust that your body knows what it needs, even when that doesn't match what the world tells you you should need. And rest, however that rest comes. First sleep, second sleep, or one long stretch. Napping or not napping. Early to bed or late to rise. All of it is human. All of it is real. All of it is okay. Let that permission wash over you now. Let it dissolve the anxiety, the pressure, the sense that you're doing something wrong. You're not. You're just sleeping. In your own way. In a way that connects you to the full, rich, varied history of human rest. And that's not just okay. That's beautiful. Rest now. In whatever way feels right. The ideal can wait. Your body knows better. We've come to the final part of our journey through the history of sleep. We've traveled from the deep past, through medieval nights and industrial revolutions, through the glow of gas lamps and electric bulbs, to arrive here. In our modern world, with our modern sleep, or what we think of as modern sleep. But here's what's fascinating. Despite everything we've discussed, despite industrialization and artificial light, despite medical ideals and cultural pressure, the old patterns haven't completely disappeared. They're still here, still visible, still alive in ways we often don't recognize. And there's still so much we're learning, so much we're debating, so much we don't fully understand about sleep and its history. Let's settle in for this final exploration, this consideration of what remains, what's been lost, and what questions still linger. Breathe slowly, rest deeply, and let's reflect together on where we are now, and what the past might teach us about the present. Despite the complete dominance of monophasic sleep as the cultural ideal, despite the entire modern world being structured around consolidated nighttime rest, something interesting persists. Many people, perhaps most people, don't actually sleep in one perfect, unbroken block. They wake at night, briefly, sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for longer. They lie there in the darkness, thoughts drifting, perhaps checking the time, perhaps not. Then they fall back asleep. Sleep researchers know this. They see it in their studies all the time. Brief awakenings are completely normal, part of the natural architecture of sleep. Most people have several each night, though they often don't remember them. They surface briefly from sleep, perhaps adjust their position, perhaps open their eyes for a moment, then sink back down into slumber. But here's what's telling. Many people who have longer wakeful periods, who lie awake for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, experience anxiety about this. They lie there worrying, thinking something must be wrong, calculating how much sleep they're losing, feeling their heart rate increase with stress, which of course makes it even harder to fall back asleep. They're experiencing something that might be perfectly natural, an echo of that wakeful interval between first and second sleep. But because they've been taught that sleep should be continuous, they interpret it as a problem, as failure, as pathology. This is one of the most poignant legacies of the sleep transformation we've been exploring. Not just that our sleep patterns changed, but that we've lost the framework for understanding wakeful periods at night as potentially normal, even beneficial. Imagine if, instead of lying there anxious, people recognized that waking in the night might be natural, that humans did this for thousands of years, that it was a time for quiet reflection, for processing dreams, for peaceful contemplation. Would they relax more? Would they fall back asleep more easily? Would they suffer less from what we call sleep maintenance insomnia? We don't know for certain, but it's an intriguing possibility that some of our sleep struggles might be less about the sleep itself and more about our expectations and interpretations. Beyond these nighttime wakings, there are other places where older patterns persist. Most notably, napping. Napping never went away, despite the dominance of monophasic sleep ideology. In many cultures, particularly those in warmer climates, the afternoon nap, the siesta, remains a cherished practice. Spain is famous for it. Much of Latin America practices it. Parts of the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, the siesta tradition persists. And it persists for good reason. People find it restorative, valuable, natural. The afternoon dip in energy that many people experience, that post-lunch drowsiness, isn't just because you ate too much. It's a circadian rhythm, a natural dip in alertness that occurs in the early afternoon for most humans. Siesta cultures honor this rhythm. They rest when the body wants to rest. Northern European and North American cultures have traditionally looked down on siestas. In industrialized, Protestant work ethic-influenced societies, napping during the day was seen as lazy, unproductive, something that only children, elderly people, or the sick needed to do. But even in these anti-napping cultures, napping persists. People sneak naps when they can. Fall asleep on couches on weekend afternoons. Doze off on trains and buses during commutes. Some workplaces are beginning to recognize the value of napping, installing nap rooms or allowing brief rest periods, though this is still controversial and relatively rare. What's interesting is that research consistently shows napping is beneficial for most people. A short afternoon nap, 20 to 30 minutes, can improve alertness, mood, and cognitive performance. Longer naps of 60 to 90 minutes allow people to complete a full sleep cycle and can be deeply restorative. This shouldn't be surprising, given our history. Humans likely evolved with biphasic or polyphasic sleep patterns. The afternoon nap isn't a deviation from the norm. The insistence on pure monophasic sleep is. In rural and indigenous communities that have maintained traditional lifestyles, sleep patterns often remain more flexible. Anthropologists and sleep researchers studying these communities continue to find patterns that don't match the industrial monophasic ideal. The Hadza people of Tanzania, hunter-gatherers who maintain a largely traditional lifestyle, show flexible sleep with nighttime waking and opportunistic napping. The Tsimane people of Bolivia similarly sleep less than the recommended 8 hours at night, but incorporate rest throughout the day. Among various indigenous Arctic peoples, where seasonal light patterns are extreme, sleep remains highly flexible and adapted to environmental conditions. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are living examples of human sleep functioning differently than the modern Western ideal. And importantly, people in these communities generally don't report sleep problems. They're not suffering from inadequate rest. Their patterns work for them, in their contexts. This suggests something important. There isn't one correct way for humans to sleep. There are many ways, many patterns, many approaches. And they can all be healthy, natural, functional, if the social and environmental context supports them. Which brings us to those laboratory studies we mentioned earlier. The research by Thomas Wehr and others, showing that modern people placed in conditions of natural lighting can spontaneously revert to segmented sleep patterns. These studies are relatively small. They involve placing people in controlled environments, often for several weeks, where they're exposed only to natural light or simulated natural light patterns. No electric lighting, no electronic screens, no artificial extension of the day. And consistently, across multiple studies, something similar happens. After an adjustment period, people's sleep begins to segment. They sleep for 3 to 5 hours, wake for 1 to 3 hours, not anxiously, but calmly, often reporting feelings of quiet meditation or peaceful wakefulness. Then sleep again for 3 to 5 hours. First sleep and second sleep. Just like in the historical record. Just like a church found in all those old documents. What this suggests is profound. It implies that segmented sleep isn't just a historical or cultural phenomenon. It's biological, a natural human pattern that emerges when we're not under the influence of artificial lighting and rigid schedules. The pattern is still there, encoded in our biology, waiting to express itself in the right conditions. But, and this is important, we shouldn't romanticize this or draw overly simple conclusions. Those laboratory studies show what can happen, not necessarily what should happen for everyone. They demonstrate biological flexibility, the capacity for different sleep patterns, but they don't prove that segmented sleep is superior to consolidated sleep, or that everyone should adopt it. And this brings us to the debates. Because historians, anthropologists, and sleep researchers continue to discuss and disagree about many aspects of this history we've been exploring. Some scholars question how universal segmented sleep really was. Yes, there are hundreds of references to first sleep and second sleep in European historical documents. But Europe isn't the world. And even within Europe, the evidence is somewhat concentrated in certain time periods and regions. Was segmented sleep truly universal? Or was it one pattern among several? Was it practiced by everyone or mainly by certain classes or groups? These are legitimate questions. The historical record, rich as it is, has gaps. We can't survey people from the 1600s about their sleep habits. We have to infer patterns from indirect evidence, references in diaries, court records, literature, medical texts. This evidence is valuable but incomplete. Some historians argue that even in pre-industrial times, there was probably significant variation in sleep patterns. Some people might have practiced clear segmented sleep. Others might have slept in more consolidated blocks. Still others might have had patterns that varied seasonally or based on work demands or individual preference. This variation matters because it complicates the narrative. It's tempting to tell a simple story. Everyone used to sleep in segmented patterns. Then industrialization changed everything, and now everyone sleeps in consolidated blocks. But reality is messier, more variable, more complex. Even today, not everyone sleeps in perfect consolidated blocks. Sleep patterns vary by individual, by age, by circumstance. Some people are natural short sleepers who feel rested after 6 hours. Others need 9 or 10. Some people are night owls whose circadian rhythms run later. Others are larks who wake early naturally. Some people nap regularly. Others never nap. Humans are variable. We always have been. And while broad cultural patterns certainly exist and matter, individual differences persist within those patterns. So perhaps the most accurate way to understand sleep history is not as a transformation from one pattern to another pattern, but as a narrowing of acceptable variation. Pre-industrial societies may have had diverse sleep patterns, with segmented sleep being common, but not universal. Industrial society imposed a much narrower ideal, Monophasic consolidated sleep, and created social structures that made it difficult or impossible to deviate from that ideal. The problem isn't that everyone used to sleep one way, and now we all sleep differently. The problem is that we used to have flexibility, and now we don't. But here's what historians and sleep researchers broadly agree on, across all the debates and discussions. Modern sleep is not purely biological. It's deeply shaped by technology, work structures, and culture. This is the crucial insight. Sleep feels so natural, so personal, so biological that we tend to think of it as being determined entirely by our bodies. We assume there's a correct, natural way to sleep, and that science should be able to tell us what it is. But sleep is biocultural. Yes, there are biological foundations, circadian rhythms, sleep homeostasis, the architecture of sleep cycles. But how these biological foundations express themselves depends enormously on cultural context, technological environment, and social structures. People in pre-industrial Europe slept differently than people in industrial England, not because their biology changed, but because their environment and culture changed. People in siesta cultures sleep differently than people in Northern European cultures, not because of fundamental biological differences, but because of cultural practices and climate adaptations. And you, right now, sleep the way you do partly because of your individual biology, yes, but also because of the culture you live in, the technology surrounding you, the work schedule you keep, the social expectations you've internalized, the lighting environment you inhabit, the beliefs you hold about what good sleep looks like. Understanding this, really internalizing it, can be liberating. It means your sleep struggles might not be personal failings or biological inadequacies. They might be mismatches between your body's preferences and your environment's demands. It means there isn't necessarily one correct way to sleep. There are many ways, many patterns, and what works best for you might not match the cultural ideal, and that's okay. It means we have more agency than we might think. We can't change the entire industrial structure of society, but we can make choices about our personal environments, about lighting, about schedules, to the extent we have control over them, about how we respond to waking at night, about whether we allow ourselves to nap, about what good enough sleep looks like for us. As you rest now, continuing to sink deeper into whatever sleep pattern your body chooses tonight, you might feel a sense of relief, a loosening of pressure, a release of anxiety. You don't have to sleep perfectly. You don't have to match any ideal. You don't have to achieve 8 unbroken hours every single night. You just have to rest, in whatever way you can, in whatever way your body, in your circumstances, in your environment, finds possible. That might look like consolidated sleep, or it might look like waking in the night and lying peacefully for a while before sleeping again. It might include naps, or it might not. It might be 7 hours, or 9, or 6.5. All of these patterns are human. All of them have historical precedent. All of them can support health and well-being, given the right context and the right attitude. The history we've explored together isn't meant to make you feel bad about modern life, or to suggest we should all try to recreate medieval sleep patterns. That's neither possible nor necessarily desirable. Instead, this history is an invitation to think more flexibly about sleep, to question assumptions, to be gentler with yourself when your sleep doesn't match the ideal. To recognize that sleep has always been diverse, variable, responsive to context. And maybe, just maybe, to sleep a little better. Because you understand now that whatever your sleep looks like, segmented or consolidated, long or short, with naps or without, you're part of a long, rich, complex human story. A story that spans millennia, that crosses continents, that includes countless patterns and practices and approaches. Your sleep is part of that story. Valid, real, human. Rest now in that knowledge. Rest in the understanding that there is no single correct way. Only your way, your body's wisdom, your pattern, and whatever that pattern is, it's enough. You're enough. Your sleep is enough. Let that truth carry you now, gently, into whatever rest awaits. First sleep, second sleep, or something entirely your own. All of it is natural. All of it is human. All of it is perfectly, beautifully okay. Rest now. Just rest.